Hey guys, this is Rumble. So this is something I've wanted to talk about for a while, and I never really had the platform to do it. So I'm just going to make a video about it. It may sound like a weird subject to you, but this is something that really eats at me. The problem is regarding Game of Thrones or the Song of Ice and Fire series in general, and a serious logistical oversight that I just don't think anyone has ever really addressed, but especially George R. R. Martin hasn't addressed it yet. Maybe we'll get something about this in the next book, Winds of Winter, which is supposed to be the beginning of winter in Westeros, so that would make sense. The problem is this, right? So in Game of Thrones, in this world of A Song of Ice and Fire, you have winters that regularly last for years. Year-long, multi-year-long winters. I think like 8 years is the longest that's on record in the setting. I think Gran said that to Bran or whatever. But the problem is, what do they eat? You see, I can't wrap my head around this. So you have harvests, right? You harvest grain, and then presumably you put it in a granary, and then you eat it when times are scarce. That's how harvests have worked since the beginning of time. But in the Song of Ice and Fire setting, you have 8-year-long famines regularly. This is normal. This is what everyone deals with. Do they not have winter every year, and they just farm non-stop throughout the entire summer and then stockpile colossal amounts of grain? 8 years worth of grain to feed an entire kingdom would take up an enormous amount of space. I mean, each village would need a granary that can hold 8 years worth of grain for every person in the village. Each castle would need a granary that can hold 8 years worth of grain for the entire garrison and the royal family of the fortress. Now, this might be the reason why, and people have commented on this before, all of the castles in the setting are ridiculously large. Dragonstone and Winterfell and Storm's End are all gigantic fortresses. They're like implausibly large, to the point where they would be difficult to defend. Harrenhal is a ludicrously huge fortress. Is this because they need to store colossal amounts of grain in them? But if that were the case, you'd think we would have had it mentioned by now. I mean, let's think about this, right? So in feudal Japan, the amount of the base unit of currency on like the national level for government purposes was a koku, which was supposedly enough rice to feed one man for a year. And this was a barrel, a large barrel of rice. And it wasn't really enough to feed a man for a year. It was like enough to keep a man barely alive for a year. It was theoretically enough to feed a man for a year. In reality, you'd probably need 2, and then plus some other foods so that they don't die of scurvy or something. So you would need 2 or 3 large barrels of rice per year per man. Grain is presumably similar. Maybe it's slightly less nutritious. I've heard that said. I'm not 100% on that. But for Winterfell had a garrison of, I think it was like 100 men. So that would be 300 large barrels of grain times 8. So 800 large barrels of grain to maintain a barely subsistence livelihood, to keep these men just barely alive throughout the entire time that they're in the fort at winter. And every village would need more than that. A village of 300 people would need some just ludicrous amount of grain. You'd need, 900 barrels, 600, 900 barrels a year for 8 years. So you would need about, oh geez, like 7,000 barrels of grain. It'd be huge. And that's not accounting for people who were born during the time, though I presume a similar amount of people would die, and babies probably don't eat as much. I guess their mothers just have to eat and then provide them with milk. But, this is not a joke. This is a serious logistical hurdle. An entire civilization would need to be designed around this kind of hurdle. You would see massive architecture going back for thousands of years based solely around this. We still find the gigantic granaries in ancient Egypt, and not the pyramids, that's stupid, but others. We still find huge granaries in Mesopotamia, and they used to belong to the Akkadian Empire and stuff. And the Romans famously had an enormous granary system because they sort of relied on the grain dole to keep their population alive after most of the agrarian wealth got concentrated in the hands of of the latifundum system and a handful of wealthy landowners. But that doesn't really have a bearing on this, because even in these societies you didn't have 8-year-long famines unless there was a war or something. Which brings us to another point, which is that Westeros has gone through multiple horrible, huge civil wars in its history. Why are there still people in this country? If you had a war in the Riverlands, which is supposedly the richest part of Westeros, I believe. No, that might be the Martell lands, but the Riverlands are supposed to be pretty rich, pretty fertile, and not Martell lands. Who is it? The flower people. Oh, it's somehow it slipped my mind, but Marguerite and Tyrell. That's it. The Tyrell family. They have the most fertile lands. I guess their lands probably weren't burned down so much during Robert's Rebellion, because it was Dragonstone and Storm's End that were getting wrecked mostly. So that was the Stormlands, not necessarily Highgarden and all that territory. But even so, if you had a gigantic war where many towns and villages were burned and crops were raised and huge armies were raised, which meant that you're sucking up a lot of the manpower of the country, and unrealistically perhaps, but peasants are levied en masse into these gigantic armies, and basically your agricultural output is smashed for years. What happened the next winter? There should have been an enormous famine, a die-out, the likes of which you don't see except in like early Pilgrim days, when the inefficient system of land management, it was communal ownership, resulted in people basically underworking the land because they were lazy and figured someone else would just do it. And we have a communal store, so we'll all be fine. But then you all starve to death when winter comes. Because the only way to really survive subsistence agriculture is to have people perpetually in fear of their lives. They have to have the constant terror of the winter. Otherwise, they won't work as hard as they can, and things will go wrong. You'd think that a war would be the worst possible thing to happen here. This would be a calamity without par, and yet it is never mentioned anywhere in the series. That, oh yeah, we had a war, and then 70% of the population starved to death in the winter. The Riverlands should be a wasteland. There should be ghost towns where there's no one left because everyone starved to death. The North seems like it would be even worse off, because the North, to begin with, is cold and not terribly rich and doesn't have a super high density of agriculture, presumably. We hear about how poor the lands are. How do these people survive the winter? Do they hunt? How do the deer survive? What do they eat? If you had a winter that lasted 8 years, there wouldn't be any deer. They would all die. Deer survive off of foliage, which doesn't last that long in winter. It sheds its leaves because it has to. And that's another thing. How is the plant life here identical to the plant life on Earth. You would think that, given that it has to essentially go dormant for years at a time in order to have any chance of surviving the winter. That's why plants do that. And they sort of pull themselves in and just sort of go into hibernation mode because there isn't enough light and warmth for them to really survive the winter if they just try to continue business as normal. Evergreens are different because they're very efficient to begin with. But evergreens generally, you don't see a whole lot of evergreen shrubs and evergreen low-level foliage. So unless the deer are eating trees, it just doesn't make sense. These are questions that are not going to be answered. I guarantee it, because it's too late. I think Martin just didn't expect the series to go on this long. He wasn't really thinking this stuff through. He just thought the concept was cool. If you look at the original drafts of a Song of Ice and Fire, you almost never see reference to this kind of thing. It's a very short story. The original draft, which is just hilarious, by the way, it sounds like the most stereotypical fantasy schlock ever. The Dragon Lords of Valerian, the last of the Dragon Lords, Daenerys Targaryen returns and has a climactic battle to retake her throne and fight off the forces of darkness. And it's like, man, this sounds like Wheel of Time stuff. But then, because it's sold, and I guess because Martin is just a cynic who was trying new things at the time, he ended up with this very grim, very low-feeling fantasy, when in fact, the series has the premise of an extremely high fantasy series. It's one of the things I like about it. It has its problems, and one of them I've just revealed is that the world makes no sense. I would very much like to have your guys' opinions on this. If someone mentioned this to Preston Jacobs, I'm sure he would love to sink his teeth into this sort of thing, because this is a serious problem. And it's the sort of overthinking of a lore point that I think he would like. And also, just in general, we've had so much time to think about these books. And so much time waiting for that fat fuck to finish, the latest novel. Stop watching football for 20 minutes and maybe write a few pages of the book. I get it, right? Yeah, you got things to do. He has a legacy to worry about, but also football. I don't know. So I guess that's it. I might do a few more videos like this. I have some serious questions about sort of the technological level of A Song of Ice and Fire. Well, I'll go into that in another video. That's all for now. This is Rumble signing out.